The evening unfolded beneath the blazing studio lights with the deceptive comfort of routine, the kind of manufactured normalcy that television perfected over decades, where every laugh track, every camera pan, and every practiced smile suggested safety, predictability, and control, and yet beneath that polished surface, something restless stirred, unseen but unmistakable, as Jimmy Kimmel arrived earlier than usual, not because he was anxious but because instinct told him that this night would not behave like the others, that the air itself felt heavier as though charged with unsaid things, and as he greeted stagehands, writers, and producers, exchanging jokes and reassurances, he noticed subtle signs that confirmed his unease: voices slightly lowered, glances held a fraction too long, the quiet efficiency of people preparing not just for entertainment but for containment, and while the audience filed in laughing and chatting, unaware that they were stepping into a moment designed to fracture the boundary between performance and consequence, Jimmy sat behind his desk reviewing notes he already knew by heart, feeling the peculiar tension of familiarity and danger coexisting in the same space, because this was not simply another monologue night or celebrity interview but an encounter preloaded with history, symbolism, and the unspoken weight of power. And when the band finished warming up and the applause signaled the show's imminent beginning, the doors at the side of the stage opened with a timing so precise it felt orchestrated beyond production, revealing two figures whose presence instantly rewrote the emotional architecture of the room. Melania Trump entering first with an almost ceremonial composure, her posture immaculate, movements restrained yet deliberate, conveying a kind of authority that did not need words, followed moments later by Ivanka Trump, whose entrance carried a different energy altogether, confident, alert, visibly prepared, her expression balancey. And in that instant the audience's applause shifted in tone, no longer casual but edged with curiosity and uncertainty, because these were not merely guests but symbols, living embodiments of narratives that had shaped public discourse for years, and Jimmy, rising to greet them, felt the silent recalibration occur within himself as host and participant, recognizing that humor alone would not govern this exchange, that tonight demanded precision, restraint, and courage in equal measure, and as they took their seats the atmosphere settled into an uneasy politeness, conversation flowing smoothly at first as they discussed travel, appearances, public life, the predictable rituals of late-night television, yet every word landed with added significance, every pause seemed intentional, as though the room itself were listening for something unscripted to emerge, and Jimmy sensed the audience leaning in not physically but emotionally, waiting for the shift they could feel approaching even if they could not name it, because beneath the surface pleasantries lay a question that had circulated quietly in political whispers and digital corners, a question that carried the dangerous allure of forbidden curiosity, and as the minutes passed Jimmy weighed the risk not in terms of ratings but in consequence, aware that asking it would transform the evening irrevocably, yet equally aware that avoiding it would feel like surrender to silence, and so when the moment arrived it did not announce itself with drama but with stillness, the kind that precedes impact, and Jimmy's voice, calm but sharpened by intent, redirected the conversation toward public rumor, toward speculation that had no place in polite society yet thrived in shadows, invoking a claim attributed to a political figure that questioned lineage, identity, and truth itself, and the effect was immediate and visceral as the audience collectively inhaled. And who bore the cost when curiosity challenged authority, and as silence stretched and cameras lingered, it became clear that the evening had crossed an invisible threshold, that the rules governing laughter and lightness had been replaced by something older and more dangerous, where calm itself became a weapon and restraint a declaration, and Jimmy, fully aware now that there was no retreat to safer ground, understood that the night had already become something history would replay, dissect, and argue over long after the lights dimmed, because from this moment forward every word spoken, or withheld, would shape not just the segment but the story itself, and the ordinary had irrevocably given way to the extraordinary. The silence that followed Jimmy's carefully delivered question did not behave like ordinary quiet but instead expanded outward, filling every corner of the studio with a pressure that felt almost physical, as if the air itself had thickened and demanded acknowledgement. And in that suspended moment the audience ceased to be spectators and became witnesses, their collective stillness reflecting an instinctive understanding that whatever came next would not be undone because silence in spaces of power is never empty but weighted with calculation, and Melania Trump, seated with a posture so composed it bordered on ceremonial, allowed several seconds to pass before responding. Not because she lacked words but because she understood timing as a form of dominance. Knowing that the pause itself unsettled more effectively than any sharp retort, while Ivanka remained motionless beside her, eyes forward, expression controlled yet alert, absorbing every micro-reaction from Jimmy, the cameras, and the crowd, as though mapping the room in real time, and when Melania finally spoke her voice was low, measured, almost gentle, yet unmistakably firm. The kind of tone that did not escalate but instead froze momentum in its tracks. Entered territory where humor could no longer soften edges, and Jimmy, sensing the shift, attempted a recovery that balanced apology with persistence, his voice lighter than his eyes betrayed, emphasizing public curiosity and the inevitability of speculation in the digital age, framing himself as a conduit rather than an instigator. Yet even as he spoke it became evident that the usual mechanisms of late-night discourse, irony, satire, plausible deniability, were losing their effectiveness. Against the calm resistance forming before him, and Ivanka, who until then had remained silent, chose that precise moment to speak, her voice cutting cleanly through the lingering echoes of Melania's words, her tone sharper, more direct, lacking ornamentation, asserting not just displeasure but consequence, reminding Jimmy and everyone watching that live television did not grant immunity from accountability. That words carried weight beyond ratings or applause, and as she articulated the seriousness of making such claims, the audience reacted viscerally, a collective intake of breath rippling across the studio as the implication of real-world ramifications settled in, and Jimmy's posture shifted subtly, shoulders tightening, the confident lean he had mastered over years of hosting giving way to a more cautious alignment. Because this was no longer a rhetorical sparring match but a confrontation between public performance and private authority, and the cameras, trained to capture drama, lingered on expressions rather than words, on the controlled stillness of Melania, the focused intensity of Ivanka, and the host's recalibrating composure, each shot amplifying the psychological stakes, while the band sat motionless, instruments idle, understanding instinctively that music would be an intrusion into a moment that demanded gravity. And as Jimmy attempted to reframe once more, invoking public discourse and transparency, the argument felt increasingly fragile against the united front before him, because Melania's silence now carried its own authority, reinforcing Ivanka's warning without repetition, a wordless alignment that communicated resolve more powerfully than debate, and the audience, once eager for spectacle, now found itself grappling with discomfort. Torn between fascination and the dawning realization that they were observing a boundary being enforced in real time, and within that tension lay a deeper truth about power dynamics in public spaces, about how control often shifts not through volume but through restraint, and Jimmy, acutely aware of the cameras broadcasting this exchange beyond the studio walls, recognized that his role had transformed from provocateur to participant in a lesson he had not anticipated. One that exposed the limits of satire when confronted with unwavering composure, and as the conversation hovered at this precipice, unresolved yet undeniably altered, it became clear that the evening's narrative had slipped beyond entertainment into something far more consequential, where every subsequent word would either escalate or concede, and the audience waited, breath held, knowing that the direction chosen in the next moments would define not only the segment but the legacy of the night itself. What followed was not an explosion but a slow, deliberate escalation, the kind that unfolds with an almost surgical precision, as Jimmy, aware that retreat would signal defeat yet advancement carried real risk, chose instead to stand his ground in the only way he knew how, by leaning into the role of questioner, framing persistence as duty, and duty as service to an unseen public that demanded answers. And as he straightened the stack of cue cards on his desk with a sharp, controlled movement, the sound of paper against would cut through the stillness like a warning bell, signaling that the conversational mask had been discarded, and when he spoke again his voice carried a harder edge, stripped of humor, invoking phrases like public interest and right to ask, language that reframed curiosity as obligation, and the audience felt the temperature in the room shift yet again. Because this was no longer a test of politeness but a contest of legitimacy, and Ivanka's response came not with anger but with decisive clarity, her posture changing as she rose slightly from her seat, not fully standing but asserting physical presence, signaling control through movement rather than volume, and her words, carefully chosen, emphasized boundaries, legality, and consequence, reminding Jimmy that platforms did not grant sovereignty, that visibility did not erase responsibility. And the studio reacted instantly, murmurs breaking into sharp whispers as viewers recognized the gravity of a line being drawn, while Melania remained seated, hands folded, her calm now functioning as an anchor, grounding the moment and lending Ivanka's firmness an unspoken endorsement. And it was in that contrast, the stillness and the motion, the silence and the declaration, that the power of the exchange truly crystallized, because together they embodied two complementary forms of authority. One rooted in restraint, the other in action, and Jimmy, for all his experience, found himself navigating a terrain where neither sarcasm nor persistence offered safe passage, and as he pressed once more, invoking transparency and denial, the audience sensed the diminishing returns of his approach, because each repetition only reinforced the boundary being asserted against him. And when Ivanka alluded to escalation beyond the studio, her implication unmistakable, the room collectively understood that the confrontation had transcended performance, entering a realm where reputations, institutions, and influence intersected, and the cameras captured Jimmy's brief hesitation, a fraction of a second where calculation overtook confidence, revealing the human cost of pushing too far, and in that pause the audience saw not a host but a man reassessing the balance of power. And though he attempted to reclaim momentum with a declarative statement that framed the issue as unresolved, his words lacked the earlier conviction, diluted by the recognition that authority had shifted decisively away from the desk and toward the guests, and as Ivanka straightened fully, signaling an intention to disengage rather than argue, the gesture itself carried finality, suggesting that dialogue had reached its limit, and Melania's gaze lifted at last, meeting Jimmy's with a calm that conveyed neither victory nor defeat but certainty, the certainty of someone who knows when a moment has passed, and the audience, now silent once more, felt the weight of that realization, understanding that what they were witnessing was not a debate to be won but a boundary being enforced, and as the energy in the studio settled into a tense equilibrium, it became evident that the evening had entered its final act. Shaped not by answers given but by lines drawn, and the unresolved nature of the exchange only deepened its impact, leaving viewers with the unsettling awareness that some questions, once asked, cannot be taken back, and some silences speak louder than any response ever could. The end did not arrive with applause or resolution but with a slow, deliberate withdrawal, the kind that leaves an echo long after the source has vanished, as Ivanka's decision to disengage signaled not surrender but finality, a closing of doors rather than an opening of debate, and Melania rose beside her with the same controlled elegance she had brought into the room, her movement unhurried yet unmistakably purposeful, communicating without words that the exchange had concluded on their terms, and in that moment Jimmy understood that the power he had relied upon for years, the authority of the desk, the cameras, the audience, had reached its limit, not because it was challenged loudly but because it had been rendered irrelevant by composure and restraint. And as the women turned toward the exit, the studio remained frozen, no producer intervening, no band cueing music, no applause breaking the tension, because everyone present sensed that any attempt to soften the moment would only cheapen its gravity, and Jimmy, left seated beneath the lights that now felt harsher than before, watched as the figures who had reshaped his evening disappeared beyond the stage doors, taking with them not answers but certainty, the certainty that some narratives refuse participation, and the audience, finally released from its collective stillness, began to murmur in low tones, not celebratory but contemplative, as though processing a shared experience that resisted easy categorization. And in the quiet aftermath Jimmy adjusted his microphone and addressed the viewers with a measured acknowledgement, his voice steadier now but stripped of its earlier bravado, offering neither apology nor justification. Only recognition that the evening had diverged from expectation, and as the cameras pulled back and the show moved toward its close, the significance of what had transpired settled over the room like a slow-falling curtain, because the confrontation had not delivered revelation but reflection, exposing the delicate balance between inquiry and intrusion, between public curiosity and private boundary. And long after the broadcast ended the impact continued to ripple outward, carried in conversations, headlines, and debates that sought to assign meaning to the silence left behind, and for those who had witnessed it firsthand the memory lingered not as scandal but as a study in power, a reminder that authority does not always announce itself with volume or force but can instead emerge through stillness, through refusal, through the calm certainty of knowing when not to speak. And as the studio lights dimmed and the set was dismantled piece by piece, the night's lesson remained intact, unresolved yet unmistakable, affirming that some questions transform the moment they are asked, not by the answers they extract but by the boundaries they reveal, and that in spaces built for spectacle, the most enduring impact often comes not from confrontation itself but from the quiet, unwavering decision to walk away.